Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for all that you do. In his book, Onward, Russell Moore wrote these words a few years ago. The Bible Belt is collapsing. And he said to that, good riddance. Moore celebrated the demise of what has often been called cultural Christianity. Moore's book was awarded Book of the Year by Christianity Today in 2016. His voice was unusually influential because from 2013 to 2021, he served as the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. That means he was the primary voice from an official denominational perspective on politics, public affairs, and current cultural issues for the nation's largest Protestant evangelical denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. To say it clearly, the primary political spokesman for the largest denomination of American conservative evangelicals was celebrating the decline of cultural Christianity. Now, he has left the Southern Baptist Convention. He now serves as editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And my point in referencing this quote is not to give a speech about Russell Moore or to engage in straw man polemics. I'm a Southern Baptist. I defended and supported Russell Moore when critics began to surface. He spoke at our church in Clearwater. He was one of the first speakers that I invited to speak at our National Pastors Conference when I had the privilege of leading that conference. And he has said and written many good things. I mention Moore because he was and he is an influential voice in American evangelicalism, and he best personifies an approach to political and social issues that became widely embraced, not just in my own network, but throughout evangelicalism, among many pastors and many influencers. Many young leaders embraced a type of pragmatism in ministry that sought to downplay divisive rhetoric and political issues. They sought to use a Tim Keller phrase, a third way. That is, a political voice that was neither on the right or on the left. And it sought to avoid any hint of intense partisanship. And this goes back to rhetoric that people have used for a long time. Tony Evans would always bring the house down when he would say, God doesn't ride on the backs of donkeys or elephants. Rick Warren once said, I'm not for the left wing or the right wing, I'm for the whole bird. And a few days ago, he posted a meme that implied that since Jesus was crucified in the middle between two thieves, the appropriate course was usually not on the left or on the right, but in the middle. Another speaker at the Southern Baptist Convention recently said, God is not on the right or the left. He is above all, over all, and Lord of all. Now, I know that one well because I said it. And there is, of course, a sense in which such rhetoric is true. God is not defined by ever-shifting, always relative political labels. But while such rhetoric may have an element of truth, it badly misses the cultural moment. It's also true, for instance, that sunscreen prevents sunburn. But if someone is selling it in the middle of a snowstorm, you would either assume they are ignorant or they are up to some nefarious end. The men of Issachar were said to know both the times and to know what to do. And many in evangelical circles, both in leadership and in our pews, have failed miserably to understand the times. We live in a time of pressing social and political issues that have a very clear moral context. And God is definitely on one side and not the other. As someone has said, it's not that religion is becoming more political, it's that politics got more religious. And it is not courageous to always mitigate towards some middle ground as if the truth is found in some midpoint between two extremes. Balance is a good and needed thing, But the truth is not defined by the right or the left or the middle. It is defined by the character of God. It is unchanging and it is transcendent. And it is neither courageous nor wise to refuse to state the truth when there is a political cost, especially when there is a political cost. Many pastors have been seduced into refraining from political statements under the guise of missional effectiveness. We are, as one denominational official told me, not culture warriors, but missionaries engaging a non-Christian culture. Much of this has come under the heading of gospel-centered movements that claim to represent centering our churches and our ministries and our leadership around the gospel. That is the core truth of our faith in Jesus. But sadly, much of the gospel-centered talk offered a truncated view of the gospel, implying that the gospel did not have profound impact in every area of life, including the culture and including government. Such gospel-centered talk sounds good, but it misses the point. Christians have long understood the importance of government and have sought to bear influence on the same. The thesis that missional effectiveness requires silencing our voices on pressing, divisive cultural affairs is badly mistaken. The thesis seemed to be that the mission field was on our cultural and political left. The thinking goes, those most in need of the message of the gospel, and subtly the insinuation was those most open to it were on the left. If only we don't drive them away with Pharisaical, moralistic, bombastic condemnation. Pastors were told, be winsome, be gracious, nuanced, understanding, empathetic, and suddenly perhaps a harvest of souls would flood into our churches from the cultural and political left, because we will have shown them we are Christians by our love. And love here was defined as softening either our stance on moral issues or at the very least our rhetoric, which means in evangelical jargon, don't talk about controversial stuff. A generation of pastors were raised on that. But this thesis of a left-leaning mission field is off. As several have recently observed, the mission field most ready for harvest today is actually on your right and not on your left. Now, we would all agree that we are to be loving in all of our ways and Christ-like, and we seek to win people on the right and on the left, for there is none righteous, no, not one, and every person needs to repent and believe in Christ. But it is the left that most resembles the moralistic Pharisees of Jesus' time, who are certain of their self-righteousness and quick to condemn any who challenge their view or authority. There is, however, a vast populace on the right who have observed the moral insanity of the age, and if not rightward in their politics, are at least realists. They know, for instance, that men don't become women, and they have no interest in grown men with sexual fetishes hanging out in their daughters' locker rooms. Those people who may not be religious want to know if there is any institution that hasn't caved. Is there anyone who will tell the truth and will stand for what is right without fear of the mobs? The idea that somehow being missionally effective or gospel-centered by neutering our political opinions and withdrawing from social engagement is so badly flawed, and worse, it seems to have been diabolically engineered to force one side into compliance and silence, while the other side never had any intention of a ceasefire. A more classic term for this is sometimes called pietism. It possesses the idea of withdrawing into a faith that is private and personal. Politically, it describes an approach that sees politics as of the world. The reasoning goes something like this: that politics is about worldly power, secular policy, and ambitious pursuits. The emphasis is made that Jesus and his kingdom are not of this world. The reasoning goes, the early Christians did not spend time talking about gaining political power, and they did not attempt to transform the Roman Empire through political means. They would argue Jesus laid down the sword. He took up the cross. And this transformative way of thinking is what changes human hearts, and that when human hearts are changed, cultural institutions will be changed as well. And of course, there's some truth in all of this. But is it the whole truth? If one sees a bully mugging an elderly person, does anyone think it is right and proper to avoid the conflict and offer a prayer? If a child is being threatened by a predator, would we not desire someone with, and here's that explosive word, power, someone with power to intervene and stop that evil from occurring, even if it took force to do so? The questions could go on, revealing to us what you already know. Withdrawal is not an option for a godly person, and it cannot be an option for politics either. The book of Proverbs says in Proverbs 29 and verse 2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked man rules, the people groan. It is a good thing when righteous people rule. So does it not follow that we should exert some efforts to creating scenarios where righteous people rule? Doesn't loving our neighbors require that? In a political system as ours, we're not ruled by a king, we're ruled by laws. So we should work for righteous laws that govern us. And is it selling out to political pragmatism when you have to choose leaders who may personally fall short in some measurements of righteousness, but who will nonetheless work for righteous laws, especially if the alternative is rank unrighteousness? Does government matter to God? If it does, it should matter to us. As for all things, you look to the Bible to inquire about God's role and interest in human governments. And here's what you'll find. Read the Bible. God is very interested in human government. Ask Joseph, who served in Egypt. Ask Daniel, who served in Babylon and Persia, or Mordecai, who served in Persia, or Esther, or Nehemiah. All of those were significant figures in the Old Testament, and they were all government officials who God used to accomplish his purposes for his people, and in some cases for people that didn't even know God. If you study the history of the Jewish people, you will see as much information about the kings as about the prophets. And I know it was a different system of government, and I know we're talking about an Old Testament dispensation, but the issue was still human government and human authority. And God worked in it, and God worked through it. And of course, much of recorded history was in governments that weren't Jewish, such as Egypt and Babylon and Persia. If one removes the idea of God and government from the Old Testament, I'm not sure how much you would have left. Even the prophets directed much of their attention to the issues of government and those who are in authority. Further, we find God used pagan kings such as Hazael of Syria, and who Elijah anointed. Darius and Cyrus of Persia all accomplished God's purposes in human affairs. They were anointed by God's prophets, and they were spoken as being chosen by the Lord. God judged pagan kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar for their unrighteousness. Everyone is accountable to God. The idea that faith and government are separate, unrelated spheres is so untenable as to be laughable. It is so foreign to the teaching of Scripture that it borders on the heretical. Someone will say, well, what about the New Testament, the kingdom of Christ? Well, let's ask John the Baptist, who confronted Herod Antipas for his immoral behavior, an act that cost him his life. Let's ask Herod Agrippa, who was struck down by God for his arrogance and insolence. And let's ask Paul, who wrote these words, "Let everyone submit to governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God." The reason we follow laws and recognize human authority is because that authority was, and I quote, instituted by God. When Jesus took the coin and said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what belongs to God," he wasn't separating God from government. In effect, he was acknowledging the role of government and the need to submit to its authority in appropriate ways. Yes, the Christian movement emphasizes spiritual renewal and operated within the authority of the Roman government without emphasizing the need to change that government, but it did not ignore the role of government, and it would have been unthinkable to the early apostles that somehow the issues of righteousness did not pertain to those governments. Like the prophets before them, they knew that God is Lord over all human affairs, and that ultimately those in authority must give an account to him. Moreover, it should be pointed out as a practical matter that they were not in charge of the government. They were not afforded even a voice in its administration. One cannot imagine a scenario, if afforded the opportunity, where they would not have advised and indeed insisted that human leaders submit to the will of God and conform to the standards of divine righteousness. The fact is, Paul did appear before Roman governors, and he boldly proclaimed the truth. And while the priority is always to point to the lordship of Jesus Christ, it is unthinkable to imagine that in their minds such a call would be divorced from ethical implications about how to use the power that has been granted by God for good and for righteousness. They were not involved in a democratic process precisely because none existed for them. However, early Christians were involved in government. Joanna, an early follower and financial supporter of Jesus, was the wife of a government official serving under Herod Antipas. Erastus was a treasurer in Corinth. Paul refers to those who were in the household of Caesar in the book of Philippians, implying that there were several who served in Caesar's administration who were committed followers of Jesus. You know, of course, that the idea of separating God from government comes from the oft-repeated phrase, the separation of church and state. And I don't have to tell this group, that phrase is never found in the Constitution. It comes from a letter, as you know, written by Thomas Jefferson to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. Those Baptists were worried about rumors of an impending establishment of a state church in the European model, where the governments had official state churches run by the government. Jefferson assured them this would not be the case in America, as our system had erected a wall between church and state. The idea was that these two institutional realities would not attempt to control or administrate the other. Such a concept has absolutely nothing to do with the involvement of faith and government or the influence of faith upon government. I don't want the government to control the church, and I don't want any specific church, mine included, to operationally control the government. But I do most certainly want people of faith and sound conviction exercising influence over the government, because when the righteous rule, people rejoice. The reality is that if people of faith withdraw from political engagement, there are other forces all too happy to lead. If we do not lead the way, rest assured, irreligious forces will. Our faith convictions and our faith commitment are not only as valid as any other motivation for political engagement, they are more valid and more needed than any other motivation. For ours is a motivation not based on the pursuit of personal power and selfish ambition, but rather transcendent truth and divine righteousness. So we conclude government does matter to God, and our opinions, involvement, and leadership are not only to be tolerated, they're required. How should our leaders engage the political process? We should boldly and unapologetically want righteous leaders doing righteous things to bring blessing on people. What else would loving your neighbor require? Most people in biblical times had little influence over whether a righteous or an unrighteous person led the land. The best you could do was pray to God and hope for the best. If the unrighteous ruler led, you endured the best you could and prayed for the day God would take him home and hope someone better might take his place. But imagine being in a position where you could have influenced whether a righteous person ruled. Can you imagine a good and righteous person withdrawing from that opportunity to influence for good? Daniel didn't. Esther didn't. John the Baptist spoke out against Herod. Paul sought to influence the leaders he appeared for. They weren't looking for power for themselves, but that option wasn't even on the table. We live in a constitutional republic. Our government is predicated on democratic processes and works through Republican principles of representation. But the ultimate authority is the citizens who choose our elected representatives. You are at the top of the org chart. We are then, you and I, according to God's providence, granted an opportunity to influence the political order for righteous ends. To forsake that opportunity is to shirk our duty to our family, our communities, our country, and to those who come after us. Imagine a Jewish king who had the opportunity to do good, but instead abdicated his responsibility for some kind of pietistic approach and allowed evil to flourish. Would God have held him guiltless? Then how can we, who have been given so much in the sovereignty of God to use our voice and exercise our influence in a democratic state, expect to be held guiltless if we abdicate our responsibility, shirk our duty, and quiet our voice? We not only have the right to be politically active, we have the duty. We must engage by speaking with clarity and conviction. The idea imported into our churches over the last few decades that our commitment and priority to proclaiming the gospel message somehow negates or is inconsistent with our prophetic voice in the public square or our God-given right and responsibility to engage in politics is as debilitating as it is wrong. If the church chooses not to lead, rest assured other forces are all too happy to do so. What kind of father doesn't provide for his family? What kind of mayor doesn't care for his city? What kind of pastor abdicates the responsibility to shepherd the flock? What kind of soldier shirks his duty to fight for his country? But somehow you and I are supposed to buy the idea that Christian people are somehow more spiritual if we withdraw from engagement in politics and surrender the culture to forces which mock the idea of God and justice? God forbid. God forbid. I found a typology shared by Pastor Josh Howerton to be very helpful. He observed three types of leaders in the Old Testament. There are righteous leaders who do righteous things, like Josiah, and we're all glad when there are righteous leaders doing righteous things. There are unrighteous leaders who do unrighteous things. Jezebel, Ahab, and there were others. And sometimes there are men like Jehu who are flawed leaders, but God uses them to do some righteous things. God does use flawed leaders, and aren't we grateful he does? We don't ignore their flaws. We don't become blind partisans, two very real dangers, but neither should we advocate a withdrawal from cultural conflicts that have a very real moral and spiritual implication just because there's no perfect choice. There are some evangelical elites who are busy clutching their pearls at the moral flaws of certain leaders while ignoring even greater wrongs in others. They remind me of the older brother Jesus once referred to. They would rather stay away from a moment of celebration and grace because it seems beneath their moral piety. If the younger brother sees the light, we rejoice. And if a flawed politician will advocate for what is right and true, especially in a way that preserves religious liberty and human freedom, we should rejoice in that as well. Moore was wrong to celebrate the demise of cultural Christianity. What did he think was going to replace it? Others are wrong to call for a third-way withdrawal from cultural struggles with profound moral implications. Do we really imagine that somehow it will be easier to do evangelism in a pagan country or a Marxist country or a Muslim state? I don't want to live in a Muslim country. I don't want to live in a Marxist country. I don't want to live in a pagan country. Now, if God calls people to such a place, or if God chooses in His sovereignty for us to live out our lives in faithfulness in such a place, as our brothers and sisters in Syria are doing, then so be it. But this is our home, and it is natural and right and good that we want better for it. I want to live in a culture that is influenced by Christianity above all. I want a country whose institutions, whose entertainment, whose art, whose education are all affected as much as is possible by transcendent truth and a Christian gospel. Yes, evangelism will still have to be done there, and we will do it. But I contend you will have far more evangelistic fruit, and certainly far more evangelistic freedom, in a nation that even casually acknowledges the truth of God and the authority of biblical truth than in a country that hates such things. And moreover, what kind of country do I want for my children and my grandchildren? A place where the government manipulates and mutilates adolescent children in the name of gender ideology? A lawless country where strange ideologies prevent the government from enforcing basic laws to protect its citizens? A country where religious extremists butcher Christians? A Marxist state running gulags? No, I'll take the Christian culture any day of the week. A Christian culture will not bring anybody to heaven, but a lack of it will sure unleash hell on earth. David French, a Moore ally, was wrong when he said of drag queen story hours across the country that such events were, and I quote, blessings of liberty. No, they are not. They are a curse of human depravity, and standing idly by while demonic sexual ideologies are normalized at local libraries and innocent children are groomed with sexual perversion is not an option for anyone with a moral compass and an ounce of courage. When my own Southern Baptist Convention hired an investigative agency that publicly advocated for LGBTQ values to ostensibly help with investigations into sexual abuse, they justified the claim by saying the social justice end justified the rainbow-colored means. During the same period, Bud Light misfired on a marketing ploy that featured a prominent transgendered person on one of their beer cans. Their loyal drinkers revolted, costing the company as much as $1 billion in sales. Well, I'll say this for the beer drinking crowd. At least they had a spine. Things have come to a sad state of affairs when the beer drinkers have more moral compunction than some of the leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention. No, Dr. Moore, I do not celebrate the demise of cultural Christianity. And I will not slink into the shadows, accepting an inevitable decline of the nation I love. Cultural Christianity is not enough to save a man, which is why faithful churches must evangelize and preach the gospel. But cultural Christianity may well save a nation and preserve a freedom to spread the gospel. We must now concede that a new type of theological liberalism did, in fact, invade our ranks. The pragmatism of the church growth age gave birth to the third wayism in a neutral world context in the name of gospel-centeredness and missional effectiveness. It effectively neutered our voice and softened our convictional spine. Meanwhile, demonic ideologies leapt across the cultural landscape at a breakneck pace, destroying families and children and decimating a culture. Well, as Timon Klein wrote in The American Reformer, the traditional family values of Mayberry are better than the pagan values of Sodom. The former cannot say, but neither can the latter, and the former is much better for everyone. There are hopeful signs these days. Perhaps a moment of renewal is upon us. And I refer not just to the political winds, but to the signs indicating that young people are more open to spiritual truth than they've been in generations, especially young men. Young men are seeking moral guidance and theological foundation, and numbers of those are adhering to Christian convictions, or the numbers who have that are adhering to Christian conviction has leveled off after several years of decline. Maybe the tide is turning. If it does turn, it will be because of courageous men and women from the tribe of Issachar who saw the times and knew what to do. People like the folks in this room. They spoke and kept speaking when the experts told them to be quiet. They told you to be quiet, you're doing more harm than good. But you didn't listen, and thank God you didn't listen. You didn't listen to our evangelical overlords who thought they knew more than you do. May the tribe of Bible-believing and convictional Christians who raise their prophetic voice and stay engaged in the political and public processes increase. And may we accept the challenge of this day and rise to meet the challenge of this hour in the pulpit and in the political sphere as well. We should work while we have daylight left to declare as part of our gospel the truth of God's righteousness, the supremacy of His laws, and the enduring value of Christian virtue. Thank you, and God bless you.